often took out hidden credit cards, payday loans, so that, if you were looking at our normal finances, you had no idea anything was wrong. But for some reason, I came clean and I said, I've been gambling again, but the debt's a lot worse this time. Finally recognized this is not something that I can do on my own. Today, I try to make my recovery part of the way I think about everyday situation. Today, my life is completely different. Today, 13 years out from my debt, it's astounding for me to look back on that time and where I was 13 years ago, and I was truly a mess.
Hey everybody, this is part 2 of Ted's recovery story. This is the discussion portion where I ask him some really good questions, and hopefully we have some good insights for anybody who might be new in their recovery. If you haven't seen part 1, I suggest you check it out. That's where we get into the details of Ted's recovery story and his recovery process. Thanks for checking this out, and as always, please hit the like and subscribe button. It really helps us out, and we appreciate your support. Thanks.
So really, my recovery is not just about not gambling today. It really is about carrying that message to others who are suffering, to family members who may be affected by somebody else's gambling, letting them know that this is a real thing. It's potentially deadly, but that we do have tremendous treatment resources, both self-help and formal treatment in this state, and that treatment is very, very successful for people who will engage into it. And that is so gratifying to me today, to see how far I've come and do what I can just to help others today.
Well, that's amazing. Thanks for sharing. And once again, congratulations on 13 years.
Thank you so much.
So it sounds like your path to recovery, or your road to recovery, was intensive outpatient program and 12-step meetings. And I know those are usually combined for the most beneficial treatment. Just want to highlight, that might be new to some people, that forms of treatment are intensive outpatient, could be individual or group therapy. And then, of course, 12-step meetings, which a lot of people know about. It might be new to them to learn that there's Gamblers Anonymous, a gambling version of a 12-step meeting. But I wanted to ask you something about 12 steps and maybe see what your advice to a newcomer would be, because 12-step meetings carry a lot of their own stigma. A lot of people associate those as a faith-based meetings, or are a little scared of just the gravity of it all, or the misconception that everybody's there talking about their problems, and what you kind of highlighted in your instance, hearing problems that were way worse than yours and going, oh, I don't know if this is for me. What would you tell a newcomer, a person new to recovery, to help them better understand or not be so afraid of their 12-step meeting?
That's a great question. It takes a tremendous amount of courage to get to that first meeting, however you find your way, whether it's by yourself or with the support of someone else. And I'm gratified that in Las Vegas, most of the 12-step meetings that deal with gambling are open meetings. So you can show up just as a guest if you're not sure whether it's for yourself or in support of somebody else. But going to that first meeting, it can be very intimidating, very emotional, because it really is part of the first step, if you will, to admitting you've got a problem that maybe you can't control on your own. And so, I remember going to that first meeting. It was very emotional for me. I even cried a little bit as I shared. But as I mentioned before, by the end of that meeting, I had managed to convince myself that this wasn't for me. And so some of the advice I would have is not to compare the details of your story to the details of everybody else. Really see yourself as a point on a line, where your recovery is now starting. You can look back at your past behaviors to this point and all of the things that got you to this moment, and they may or may not reach the magnitude of other stories that you hear, but give that process some time. They have a saying in a lot of the 12-step meetings, go to 90 meetings in 90 days. And if at that point you decide, they're not for you, the pain will still be out there for you and whatever your addictive disorder is. But and that's a lot of meetings for some people. But some of the other stigma that may be associated with the 12-step meetings, as you mentioned, is that it's a faith-based process. And while in the steps, most of those programs do mention either a relationship to God or a higher power, it really is not a faith-based in the sense of being a religious group. You're basically allowed to define a higher power however it's meaningful for you. And this is another barrier that I set up for myself in my own recovery early on, because I identify as an atheist. I've got a very science-based educational background. So I went into the group with some of those preconceptions as well. This is a religious group. They're mentioning God. That's not going to work for me. But really, the 12 steps are, if you break them down, they're simply a process of continual self-examination. That you're looking at your own behavior through your life. Are you treating yourself well, or are you treating others well? And if not, how can you correct that? The 12 steps, if that's a struggle for you, that allusion to higher power or to God is something that you can't identify with. I'd encourage folks to Google 12 steps for atheists, and there are a number of ways in which the 12 steps have been rewritten to basically get at the gist of the meaning behind each of those steps, so that you can still work through that process. Recommended with a sponsor who has gone through it before, but some people choose to kind of go through a process themselves and read about it, and that's fine too. Again, the program is designed to kind of meet you where you are. And there's another saying that says, take what you can and leave the rest. Don't worry about the parts that you don't get or you disagree with. Just take the parts away that help you process what you're going through. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, but hopefully that'll be helpful to some people. One other thing I wanted to mention, just with regards to the religious aspects, I remember in the first few years of my recovery, I actually served as a sponsor to 4 different men at one time in my program. One was an atheist, one was an agnostic, one was a Christian, and one was a Jew who had actually converted from Islam to marry his wife. So, interesting group of men. They all knew that I was an atheist, and yet none of them had any qualms about having me as their sponsor because of the way I spoke about it. I entirely respected each of their individual connections to their own spirituality and how important that was to them. And I'd ask those who were considered themselves religious to pray on an issue, for example. That might not be something that I do personally that's relevant to me, but acceptance of whatever is working for anybody else in that program, I think, is important. It may not work for you, but that's okay. It's working for them, so be happy for them.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. Especially the point about, kind of taking what's there for you at the time and leave the rest. I noticed you talked about your mind state and where you are today, 13 years in recovery. If we could bring it back to, say, your mind state before recovery, how that compares to your mind state now, but also, like, how far in your recovery did it take for you to fully realize how bad it was prior to your recovery? I know that might set in and take a little time to set in, maybe just how mad the madness was.
I would say, well, first from the standpoint of where I was just before I began kind of my recovery process, again, I was a mess in all areas of my life. I had finally gotten to the point where I realized this wasn't something I was going to control on my own, but every day was very obsessive about gambling. I would wake up in the morning, go to work, try to figure out what's the minimum amount of work I can get done before I can take off and make up some excuse so I can be out gambling till the last minute before my daughter's daycare closed. So I gambled at the property that was closest to my daughter's daycare, so I could gamble till literally 5 minutes before her daycare closed. All the time I wasn't gambling, I was thinking about, where can I find the time to hide it? Where can I find the money and hide the fact that I'm using that money? And the rest of the time was juggling the lies that I told various people. So it was just, voices in my head about all of these things all the time. So I don't miss any of that. And that's one of the significant things that's different today is, I'm not lying about everything in my life and what's going on and where I am and what I'm doing. I can recognize more quickly. I'm certainly not perfect, but little tools like the Serenity Prayer, which is an example, even being an atheist, that's a tremendously important tool for me because it helps me recognize what I have control over directly and what I don't, and hopefully helps me let go of those things that I don't have control over more quickly than I once did. Used to have an issue with road rage, for example, where I would just cuss a blue streak and I wouldn't chase after anybody or flip them off or something, but I would let it distract me tremendously from my own driving. And when I did that, I was making the road a more dangerous place for everybody around me, for example. So that's one of the tools that I learned in the recovery process that addresses completely other areas of my life so that I'm not obsessing about those things. And again, what I mentioned previously about being able to slow down my thinking, I still use that in other areas of my life. So it doesn't mean that I don't backslide, today. It doesn't mean I don't get stressed out by other things that are happening in my life, but hopefully it means I recognize that more quickly and I address that head on rather than trying to escape, which is what I once did. What was the second part of your question there? I apologize.
Just possibly how far along in your recovery did you start to notice the change in your mental state or be able to reflect on how bad it was previously?
So that's another great question. And I would say from my first day of formal treatment, where there just happened to be a lecture on the science and psychology of the brain and that was being given. It was the first time anybody said anything that made any sense to me about why I was different. So in some ways from that first day, I started thinking about things a little differently. But I would say it was at least a year. I mean, and over the course of that year, I would say, there were little milestones where I would look back on a few months before and it's like, oh, yeah, that. And then, 6 months, oh, yeah. And what I thought I knew 3 months ago, that wasn't quite right. Or, I was a little bit, they talk about this pink cloud that happens once you get into recovery and you're feeling good and you're feeling like a world beater because all of a sudden you're not gambling and maybe you're not having as many urges. And it feels so great that sometimes the pendulum swings a little bit towards overconfidence in that area, and it can be a potential downfall. So that I definitely went through that pink cloud period, and it was at least a year before most of the things fell into place. But Aaron, I'll tell you, even 13 years out, I still have those aha moments during a meeting or talking with another person or reading something, and it's like, wow, that happened to me, or I did that, and I recognize that now, and maybe I haven't thought about it since I was doing it. So even 13 years out, I still have those little moments where I'm still learning, and hopefully again passing that on to others with either less or more time, and sharing some of those things that'll be meaningful for them as well.
That's awesome. Some people would go, what, 13 years later and you still have an aha moments, but that's great. Almost maybe difference between sobriety and recovery. Going through your recovery, your 13 years now, would be considered long-term recovery. What other aspects of your life did that affect? A lot of people, you might go into this, you just want to be sober. And whether through the 12 steps or teachings of an IOP or a counselor, it ends up transcending into other areas of your life and your brain. How did that work for you?
For sure. I think that's a good point. There definitely was a difference for me between just being abstinent from gambling and being in what I think of as recovery today. I can look at several periods where I was abstinent from gambling for several months. Now, those weren't necessarily periods of constructive thinking or other things in other areas of my life. Even though I wasn't gambling, the way I would interact or choose not to interact with people was still unhealthy. So a lot of those underlying things that would eventually serve as triggers again were there. And so, I would ultimately convince myself one way or another that I was okay now, I could try gambling again, and usually with pretty disastrous results pretty quickly. So in terms of recovery for me is about several things. It's not only about in the sense of getting better from an illness, which this is, that's part of it. It's also, I think, about recovering myself, the person that I was before I developed an addictive disorder around gambling. That person, that was a pretty nice guy before I developed a gambling disorder. But even beyond that, I think that recovery from addictive disorders, and it's almost the one process that you can go through where you end up even healthier than you were before you developed the illness. In some ways I think about it when we break a bone and reset that bone and it heals. Well, it's it's much more difficult for that bone to break at that point, exact point again. And getting further and further into recovery and applying that to all areas of my life, I feel that in all areas of my life, I'm a much healthier person than I was even before gambling became a problem for me. So that's kind of the difference for me between recovery and just sobriety or abstinence. It's recognizing that this is a process, and if you choose to make it so, it can be a continual process that can last throughout your life. And so far, all of the side effects have been beneficial. There's no mandatory copay. It's in terms of insurance or anything like that. So. And in Nevada, we're particularly fortunate that the formal treatment resources that are available, literally in every category, from one-on-one to intensive outpatient to residential, there are some options which are essentially free of charge to those who are suffering, whether they are family members or the individual suffering. So if insurance doesn't cover it, you don't have a job anymore, don't have any financial resources, you can still find lots of help in Nevada, whether it's, again, formal treatment or self-help through 12 steps.
Yes, most definitely. You can find somebody, get an assessment, talk to somebody, all free. Very important. All right, we're going to do some questions. Maybe it'll help somebody who is thinking about starting the recovery process or early on in it. Is there anything you did that impacted your recovery the most? Is there any one thing that you could say really affected your recovery process for the good?
I think a lot of that for me was coming to the realization of how my gambling activity was affecting others in my life that I cared about. For a long time, I rationalized that even when I recognized it was a problem, I rationalized that I was only hurting myself, that all of these hidden credit cards and payday loans, they were in my name, so it was my money, it was my choice. But the truth was, I had a family, I had a daughter that I was responsible for, that this money I was spending, while it may have been in my name, this was, potential early retirement for us. It was potentially my daughter's college education fund that I was spending. Not to even mention the emotional impacts, just, my anger over everything was increased. I deflected a lot of blame onto other people for my own actions. Even things like, I recognize in the first 2 years of my daughter's life, I could have spent a tremendous amount of time with her that I didn't, where I left her in daycare up till the last moment before they closed, as opposed to, picking her up an hour and a half or two earlier after a normal workday, right? And so I kind of continue to make my amends to her today. But that was an important, recognition, the idea that my activities had affected those I cared about so much, and not not going further down the road.
And then did you have any struggles throughout your recovery? Obviously, there are struggles with recovery, but I guess, what did you struggle with the most in throughout your recovery process?
I had a couple things in my case, and it's very important for me to say that everybody's process is very different in terms of what they experience. Relapse is not uncommon, so please don't give up hope simply because you've had a relapse or two and you've gone back out. Get back on that horse as quickly as possible. Get back into a meeting or back to your therapist or whatever that process is for you, and recognize that those people will be very glad to see you back. Don't ever think that you've let somebody else down and they're not going to be happy to see you back in recovery, because that recovery is good for everybody else you interact with as well. I certainly am one of those that had very few urges. I talked about urges earlier. Some people, even though they're doing everything that they're supposed to in their recovery, they still experience multiple urges every single day. In the longest cases, I talked to one gentleman who ultimately became a counselor himself. He said for the first 18 months, he says, I had urges to gamble every day. Even though I was going to meetings almost every day, they would come along. In my case, I would say since I started formal treatment, I've only had what I would call 2 urges to gamble during that time, and both of them came years out from the beginning of my recovery process. And because I had not experienced that as strongly as a lot of other people do, they almost caught me seriously off guard because I hadn't had to deal with them. One came in the form of a credit card that came in the mail that I still owed money on, and I had to keep active to keep that low interest rate. And as I was calling the number to activate that card, the message came on that said, you may now enter a 4-digit PIN for cash access. And something clicked in my brain, and I let that message cycle through 3 times before I declined it. So, it was right there. My illness was still there, even though this is several years out, and, at a time when I'm still attending meetings. And the other one came in a really big argument that I had with my wife. And all of a sudden I found myself thinking, I'll show her, I'm just going to go out and start gambling again. So, in response to this argument, there was that sudden moment when I thought, I can use gambling sort of as a revenge, or just to show her how angry I am. And it was just, while it only lasted a few minutes, it's just fortunate I wasn't, right by a casino in that moment or something, And so those little reminders reminded me that even though it's, I'm 13 years into my recovery, in some days it's just, in some ways it's like I just gambled yesterday. That thing is still waiting up there in, what's called my midbrain. As far as it's concerned, I gambled yesterday. And so keeping on the straight and narrow, keeping that recovery process going is very important. Those are I think 2 of the ways in which I struggled a little bit, and a little bit unexpectedly.
Thank you. Great insight. And especially the fact that you said it wasn't necessarily early on in your recovery. This is after a couple of years, and these notions popped up.
Absolutely. So it's still up there waiting for me. I like the analogies that some people use with regards to treatment for diabetes or heart disease. If there's a medication you need to take, you keep taking it because you feel better while you're taking it. There's some people have the tendency to think, okay, I've felt great for a long time now. I don't need that medicine for me anymore. For me, those group meetings, they are still my medicine today. I still need to do those with some regularity. And no matter how badly I'm feeling, I always feel better after I go to a meeting, listen to other people share a little bit myself. And so I think of it as my regular medicine I need to take, because I have an illness that's both chronic and progressive if I let it be without that medication. For some people, maybe they don't need it, but I certainly do.
What's the number one thing you would tell to somebody that's new in recovery, if there is one, that you've thought about over the years? I know it's a very generic question.
And I'll give it a very generic answer, which is, a comment you hear in meetings all the time, which is keep coming back. If that's your first meeting, no matter what your experience of that very first meeting is, keep going back. If you had a distressing interaction in that meeting, we are fortunate in Las Vegas in that we have over 100 meetings a week available to people who are suffering with a gambling disorder. So try another meeting. And try another meeting until you find one with a personality that suits you and where people's sharing strikes a chord with you. Don't give up because of a bad experience at your first meeting. So that's very generic, but my number one thing I would say, I guess.
Oh, it's great, Ted. Thanks. Is there anything else you would like to add that maybe we haven't talked about?
I don't think so. I'll just talk about what tremendous gratitude I have for finding my own recovery. A lot of people don't, and it's somewhat I think not only being National Recovery Month, it's also National Suicide Prevention Awareness month. And while I didn't speak about it specifically, I may have alluded to it once. This is an illness that has a very high suicide rate, which really reinforces the seriousness of it. So if you or someone you care about is suffering or suffering in silence, please recognize that this is a serious issue. Reach out to that person. Let them know that you've learned a little bit about it, whether it's from this conversation today or other things you've seen on our website or elsewhere. You may be that lifeline to that person or to yourself in becoming engaged in this process. And again, grateful to everybody out there who's part of the community that has been part of that process for me.
Well, thank you, sir. Ted Hartwell, 13 years. Where there's help, there is hope. And appreciate you sharing a little bit of the help you received and the hope you gained in the process. And
13 years may sound like a lot, but I got there one day at a time. One day at a time. The only day that's important is today and what you're doing today. Something I forgot to mention, but another wise words that come out of those meetings is not focusing in on what happened in the past or looking too far into the future, but what is the thing that you can do today to affect change in your life.
All right, Ted. Till next time. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Aaron.